To talk about the city and to engage with the idea of a city becomes very critical in the light of many of these debates that are taking place now in the country. And not only the country, but across the world. I used to discuss with people from the field who tend to tell me that if there is one perspective that is missing about the city, it is the Ambedkarite perspective, either located around the Dalit category or located around the Buddhist category. You have a very deep, sophisticated engagement of Marxists with the notion of the city. You have people who are coming from the feminist perspective who have engaged with the city. You have people from post-structuralism and even post-modernity who have engaged with the city. So you have artists, you have people from humanities, you have people from literature, from history who have engaged with the city. But the one single perspective that is missing in the debates concerning the city is the Ambedkarite perspective. So even from the Ambedkarite perspective, I said, depending on what category you kind of locate yourself in order to understand some of these and analyze and produce a way of looking at the process of the city. Now, any investigation, any act of trying to investigate the city requires us to begin from its very origin of the idea of the city itself. Because one cannot understand a city nor try to understand claims made by people on the city without digging deep into the historical past. Now, in India, we have a very, very, very long history. But that history is more mythological rather than really archaeological or really historical in that sense. So, if you look at the literature that is available about what the city is, and if you look at the Roman Empire, if you look at Europe, there's so much of writing that is available about the evolution of small towns and the rise of agricultural societies and agrarian societies, and the rise of bigger towns and the rise of walled towns and the rise of what you understand large towns, either something called cathedral towns, towns built around a cathedral religion, and so on and so forth, till you arrive at what we call the city. Now, if you trace the etymology of the city, and I was just trying to look at how did this word city erupted or arose in the context of debates concerning the naming of many of these so-called evolution of towns into larger towns. This word city is generally used in the 12th century AD within the French language and known as called as site, C-I-T-E. And C-I-T-E in the French language means town city. There's no real clarity about what a city is, but generally the word refers to a town that is slowly becoming a city. Now, the interesting part is that if you look at other languages, especially Latin, you begin to hear a word called civitas or citatem. These are very interesting words. And generally, these words, although referring to this concept of the city, does not start from anything called physical, but it starts from the notion of citizenship. So, if you were to trace the etymology of the word city, it begins not from the physical space that grew over time from a town to a city, but it grew from the notion of citizenship. And citizenship in the sense of referring to conditions or rights of a citizen, referring to a condition or a right of a citizen, that is membership in a community. So when we are referring to the notion of a city, the roots really lies in this notion of being a member of a particular place, of a right that a citizen have in that particular space. It is not it is a geographical, but not more geographical or physical, rather than more about belonging to a particular so-called space with equal rights in that particular space, in which the citizen can claim rights over that particular demarcated space. Now, later this word city began to refer to a community of citizens, a community of people who have certain rights living together in that particular place. And the other words that I use is the state and the commonwealth. So if you trace the genesis of how things have evolved, you will begin to realize that it refers to this notion of the citizenship. the membership in a community. Now, the Latin word, uh, uh, the Latin word for the word city is a word called urbs, urbs, and a resident in an urbs was a civis, civis. So the Latin word for the city is urbs, but a resident was a civis. Now, why this is important? Because it is from this word urbs that the notion urban started arising. And urban means the characteristic of city life. So when you the difference between the city and the urban is that urban is the characteristic of a city life, and the city life is that which is inhabited by people who are entitled as member through the notion of citizenship. So I think this is important to kind of send, because now the word city has gone to another realm. People are talking about city fashion, city thinking, and so on and so forth. And it has got divided further into what is generally called a city proper, a well demarcated space, and then the urban agglomeration, in which you include the suburban into the city, and then the metropolitan area, which includes a larger, even the rural into the city. So the demarcations now have become a little bit complex. It is not so simple as it used to be. Now, if you were to look at and trace about these particular processes, you realize that there is one thing that basically has happened. For a long time, especially in Europe, if you turn to the cities that you know today, like London, like Paris, like Amsterdam, many of these, like Berlin, many of these places were generally called wall towns. And wall towns basically arose from a fundamental break from the notion of feudal society. So, as you know, feudal society was a society that was rooted in the village. And these villages were very fundamental for feudal lords, because in the feudal society, there was the serf, there was the Basaheb, there was the knight, and so on and so forth. So, the structure of what we generally call medieval society, especially in Europe, was built around this notion of the feudal village. And the history goes that many people who ran away from these feudal villages, because these feudal villages under feudalism was utter oppression. Many people who ran away from these so-called feudal villages, and you ran away because something happened because of violence, you ran away because of anything, it can be many, many reasons. They ran away to a place called the wall towns. And the wall towns basically were towns in which everybody, a citizen, can claim right over. Now, people had to pay taxes in this wall town. There was somebody who were running the wall towns, and people had to pay taxes in the wall town. So whenever I run away from the village, I go to the wall town, and then I have to pay my little bit of taxes to the wall town. Revenue is generated, infrastructure is maintained, and then I have the life. I can live the life that I want within that particular wall town. Now, the history is that the feudal lords were never concerned about the wall towns, because the wall towns was, without disturbing the feudal structure, was able to give a lot of revenue to the lord. So as long as the money came, it didn't become a problem for the feudal lord. But over a period of time, these wall towns, 2, 3 things started happening. One of the beautiful things that are happening in the wall town is that a particular form of civility started arising. Now, when everybody has claims to a particular space within the wall town, and everybody has rights, then no one can trample on somebody else's rights. So if you were to play loud music in the night, and if that loud music was to disturb somebody else, now they can easily complain and say you have no right to disturb the other. So if you have things that you, for instance, a dustbin that you have at home and you want to throw somewhere else, you have to throw in the right place. You can't just throw anywhere in the road, because who will be responsible to clean it? So it is these kinds of intricate interrelationships that happen between residents or citizens of the wall town that you begin to realize this notion of civility started arising. Now, there is also a very interesting article by by people like Zizek, especially, who basically made arguments that, if you look at the history of French society, especially Paris, in Paris, for instance, perfume was a product of the wall town, because the wall towns had so many citizens that it was very, and people, the toiletry and all of that was not organized properly. Sanitation was not organized. So they produced the perfume in order to actually overcome the smell that was produced in the wall town. And the perfume was a product of the wall town. So if you look at many of these behaviors that started emerging because people started living together and living together, having relationship intersecting, however, with their own entitlements and rights. This is how they began to produce a new reality, which we call city life today. Now, if you were to look into the history, it is so clear why Babasaheb called many people to come to the city. You know, it is not because you come to the city to free yourself from the varna structure that exists in terms of the brutality of it in the village. It's also to a great extent, as much as moving away from there, coming to a space in which you become a citizen, with an equal right and an equal claim to many of these processes. So, in that particular sense, the question that we need to ask as we engage in today's discussion is that, in the light of this kind of a historical debate, and the historical debate is much more complex. I'm not able to give you the complexity of that debate to a great extent, but the question that arises then at this particular point in time in the historical evolution of, let's say, life in the in the Indian reality, the question you have to ask is like, what exactly is a city, or in that sense, an urban area? Now, as I said, we make the distinction between city and urban. Urban refers to the characteristics of city life, of life of citizens in a particular space. So, what exactly is a city or what is an urban area? The other question is, what is the size threshold for an area to qualify as a city? This is a big debate now when it comes to issues concerning a city. Then, what types of administrative, legal, or historical status defines a particular city? And how do we distinguish an urban area from a town and from a village, an urban from a rural? So it is around these types of questions that the debate is taking place around the notion of the city at this point in time. Now, I just referring some of the documents that were available. Many people who are now talking about the city post 2016, 2017, I was referring to these documents. The debate is moving around different types of definition. Like, you don't have a single definition of a city. If you roam across the world, which I will somewhat read some of these documents, if you roam across, you'll have different types of how people across the world, across countries, across regions define what a city is. Now, there's some basically who defines a city by population size. They look at a city and they say, if you have 50,000 plus, then it's a city. If you have 50,000 less, then it's not a city in that sense. There's some who defines a city by density. Okay. There's some who defines a city by administration, or what you call administrative delimitation. Okay, this is inside the city, this is outside the city. So if, for instance, the administrative structure of Mumbai municipality, for instance, is within this particular demarcated, delimited space, and that is what a city is. Outside of that, you're not a city anymore. You might be like a suburban. But as I said, there are different conceptions of what we know today: city proper, the notion of urban agglomeration, and the notion of metropolitan. There's some people who basically define a city by economic occupations. Depending on what kind of economic occupation is available in that particular part of the demarcated space, a city is defined. Now, if you look at the data that is available, recently there was a report that came out from the United Nations Habitat pertaining to Sustainable Development Goals. They did an analysis of 233 countries, okay, for which something like an urban data was available. Now, 104 countries in the world use a single criteria, and this single criteria includes administrative functions, which is used by 59 countries, population size / density, which is used by 37 countries, and urban characteristics, which is used by 8 countries. Now, these figures change significantly when these criteria are used in combination with others. For example, I read here, 121 countries distinguish urban and rural areas by combining administrative function with other criteria. 108 countries combine population size density with other measures. 69 countries combine urban characteristics with other criteria like population, density, and so on and so forth. 38 combine economic function with other criteria of population size, density, and also urban characteristics. So if you look across the world, very interesting ways in which people define this notion of a city. Now, what struck my mind was a very interesting definition of a city in Bhutan. I had gone to Bhutan recently and I was reading about Bhutan. Now, Bhutan has a very unique way of defining a city. Now, anybody who has gone to Bhutan will know that Bhutan is a very sparsely, populated. It doesn't have high density or high population. There are hills and there are, it's a huge, massive area which is inhabited by very less population. Now, there are you need to satisfy 4 out of 5 criteria to be called a city in Bhutan. Now, what are these criteria? Criteria number 1 is that to be called a city, you must have a minimum population of 1,500 inhabitants. You must qualify 1,500 inhabitants in Bhutan. Okay. B, have a threshold population density of 1,000 person per square kilometer. Okay. Number C, depend on non-primary economic activities. Number 4, surpass a set of spatial expanse not less than 1.5 square kilometers. And the 5th is demonstrate economic potential for future growth. That is, what kind of revenue you are able to bring into the state processes. It is these criteria, for instance, that will help the state to define whether you are in the city or you are out of the city. Now, if you were to compare immediately to India, you're wondering 1,500 people, then only will be defined as a city. Here in Mumbai, it's like we are talking about millions and millions of people, inhabiting. Now, interestingly, in another country, another Buddhist country, Cambodia. So Bhutan is a Buddhist country and Cambodia is a Buddhist country. Cambodia recognizes something as urban communities or places where there is a population of 2,000 inhabitants with a percentage of employment in agriculture above 50%. So if you're a place in which you are dependent on agriculture, then you are not a city. But if you're a place in which 50% or more is not agricultural based, then you can be qualified to become a city. So as you can see, the debates concerning how people look at this notion of a city across the world is very, very different. Now, the Indian debate is a very complex debate. I have not really gone, but I guess now in the presentation today, people will make some kind of propositions about it. But I will kind of now throw some light about some of the debates that has taken place about this notion of a city and what people are saying and thinking about the idea of the city. Now, but before I go into this debate of before I kind of lay a kind of the domains of debates and discussion regarding the city, I think there are 2-3 things which I think is very important to mention here. If you look at the world, there is a big intersection between the notion of the city and the notion of urban and the notion of modernity. Now, if you root this debate of the city around the conception of the modern, now modern is a very complex concept. People like us are very careful when you use the word modern. Not because of anything else, because we come from realities in which we are problematizing the notion of the modern. Now, what qualifies something as modern that intersects with the city, citizenship, and also the notion of the urban is certain structures that began to emerge in various spaces, both spatio-temporal across the world. Now, the first thing that began to emerge and that gave rise to the notion of modernity was the idea of a nation. Okay? The nation was a very important concept across the world that gave rise to the notion of the modern. The second was the process of industrialization. It is around the notion of industrialization. In the history of industrialization, if you read, it is because of industrialization that the notion of city and urbanization started to emerge. So the city and the urban historically seem to have arisen from so-called small villages, then to towns, then to the peasantization of towns, then activities and economic activities beyond 50% that then gave rise to walled towns, gave rise to a city, and so on and so forth. But in many parts of the world, it is industrialization and the creation of settlements around the industry that gave rise to the notion of the urban, the characteristics that refers to some kind of an idea called the city. Now, in this urban was inserted as part of the modernity project, the notion of technology. There was a fundamental shift from what is generally called the pre-modern to the modern around the notion of technology. With technology arose mass media. And with mass media, also in that particular sense, as part of state processes, arose what we generally call democracy and democratic systems. So the debate concerning the notion of city is rooted, is partly rooted also in the way modernity has been conceived. Now, why did I refer to this debate and why did I somewhat went to another trajectory altogether concerning the debate about cities and modernity? Is because in India, something very, very different happened. India did not follow the global trends of the emergence of the modern. Now, in India, there are tremendous structural inconsistencies. And these structural inconsistencies I will read. One, the rise of democracy and democratization without the spread of civic culture, which means there was the rise of the notion of democracy without education. Illiteracy was very high, but democracy arose. So democracy in that sense was an inconsistency because it arose out of a large chunk of the citizen becoming educated. So till today, this inconsistency, which exists as a gap between the illiterate and the democratic, because democratic system arose from literate society. It didn't arise from illiterate society. Number one. Number two, bureaucratization without commitment to universalistic norms. If you're asking why there's so much corruption in this country, the reason for that corruption is because people don't understand how bureaucracy works. The whole history of the evolution of democracy, of bureaucracy, is because people were trying to organize themselves in a much better way so that things can be done in an orderly fashion. And this is very a characteristic of a city life, bureaucracy and the notion of. But in India, something very funny happened, which is that is without these universal norms of awakening or understanding or awareness of how organization should take place in an orderly fashion, bureaucracy was embedded into that particular process. The third, the rise in mass media participation, which is communication or expectation without proportionate increase in resources. Now, if you're asking why is it that mass media or media in that sense or media participation, for instance, is the prerogative right of some elites in this country, the reason for that is because there was not an investment, a proportionate investment of resource across people in which mass media becomes part and parcel of your life. Instead, now it becomes, till the rise of YouTube, we were basically recipients of a Brahmanical domination of mass media. And mass media is basically one of the ways in which you can create what is called a debate about the city around the notion of imagination, of social imagination. There's a big debate now. How do you win the social imaginations of people merely by mass media? So only with the YouTube that we became very subversive. We have many channels, rising from the community because there's a new space and that resource is not needed so much. To own a TV channel, you need crores of rupees. Now to run a YouTube video, you don't need anything at all. Actually, you get paid for running a YouTube video, in that sense. The fifth point, modernization without meaningful changes in the stratification system. We speak about a modernity in this country without a fundamental transformation of the Varna structure, without the fundamental transformation of caste. How is it that you become modern while traditional systems are so rigidified and so embodied that you cannot even come out of it? So what is that modernity that we are talking about? And the last point, which basically is related to the notion of the city, is that there's a structural inconsistency in India in which urbanization arose without industrialization, with the exception of a few places in this country where industrialization arose and urban settlements began to actually be created around them. Many of the cities were built mostly without destroying what you generally call the Varna structure, the caste structure, and it arose simply because people had the money to invest and create it into a larger, bigger kind of processes. Now, this debate was brought in by Yogendra Singh in an article in 2016 or 2006, which is a very important article. I still remember he made a presentation when Shailesh and myself were there in JNU. And he spoke about why exactly there is a debate concerning the notion of modernity in this country and why we must try to understand it in a different kind of a fashion. So the reason that I brought this is because you can't begin to think about the Indian city outside of these debates concerning modernity, outside of these structural inconsistencies that have arisen, especially both from a sociological, political, and also a philosophical perspective. Now, the third and the last point, which I kind of want to throw here, is that many people across the world now are beginning to think very differently about the notion of the city. And it is not only in that sense, a city is not simply a material, a simply material or a lived space that generally people kind of imagine about, in a very commonsensical, doxological, doxa manner. You know, they talk about spaces and the notion of imagination. They talk about fundamental discourses regarding how cities basically are a site of social aggregation that involves in one way compulsion, order, and discipline, and as a contradiction, the ability for freedom, anarchy, and self-realization. And there are many people who talk about the idea of city uh, as I mean, I will throw some light as we move on. In urban theory, the analysis of this idea of economy. I mean, I was reading a little bit. I didn't have too much time to read, but I read a little bit about David Harvey's work and how many Marxist thinker they begin to think about the city. Because for Marxists, for instance, the base superstructure theory that exists within their framework of looking at the material condition in terms of a materialist conception of society, and this idea of the economic base as the infrastructure and the production of culture, religion, ideas, state, all manifested from the notion of who controls the economic base, is one way in which the city has been thought about. So there are different ways people are writing about the city. And I'm starting to realize the beauty of how we as Ambedkarites, as Buddhists, for instance, we need to think a little bit more seriously about this particular thing called the city. So the first point which I want to kind of make here in throwing is that city, the how do we imagine a city? Many people they have two ways of understanding the city. One is something called the lived reality, the reality of the day to day, the reality of practice, the reality of action, the reality of what you have, the day to day experience that we have, and the reality of the rhetorics, how we imagine the city to be. Like Ambedkarites and us as Buddhists, for instance, we are so much one of the forces within the city that is constantly and persistently attempting to reimagine the city. And although we are living that city or not is not important to us. The fact that we want to reimagine that city in the future around certain kind of new processes is something very fundamental to us. Now, this is a big debate about the city across the world. The ability of spaces of imagination. A city is a space of imagination. And plus, a city as a space of imagination, it's also a space of representation. I was reading this beautiful article about how people now are reimagining the city, how policymakers work in the realms of rhetoric, in the realms of imagination, in the realms of representation, in the realms of the conceptual, in the realms of the theoretical, in order to manifest policies and programs in the lived, in the physical, in the material, and so on and so forth. So, how do we envision cities, and what effect does this envisioning have on the city is one big domain in the study of cities at this point in time. And the reason for that is how city affects the imagination and how the city is imagined. This stimulates and also begins what you call the construction or the reconstruction of this idea called the city. So there's some beautiful 4 or 5 articles that I browsed through. I didn't have time to go into the details, but this is many people are writing about this, And as a matter of fact, if you look at debates across the world, this is exactly what has been done. People have actually, constructed first and imagined the city first before they built it. And some of the experiences that we have in India, especially in Andhra Pradesh, is very, very interesting. When Chandrababu Naidu was there, he reimagined, he constructed in the air through imagination a whole city. I don't know what has happened to Jagan Reddy now, but this is the kind of debate that is taking place. Now, the second thing, which I think is a little bit also important for us, is that there are some few fundamental discourses about the city. Now, I'll just read here some of the things that I kind of picked up. Cities are sites of social aggregation that involves compulsion, order, and discipline, as well as the same time as a contradiction to that. City is a space that allows freedom, anarchy, and self-realization. While it is important to see the city as a site of individual and collective emancipation, it is also important to remember that the city is an imposition and adherence to a series of master narratives. Now, as Buddhists, it's very interesting for us to understand who controls this master narrative. Who dominates the master narrative? Under what master narrative are we working? Because many of us are trying to challenge the master narrative. Because for many people, the city is something to be controlled. For many people, their master narrative must dominate. But for people like us, a city is a place of emancipation. A city is a place for liberation. A city is a place of anarchy, and that anarchy leads to a certain kind of order in which equality can be assured, in which access can be assured, in which entitlements can be protected, and so on and so forth. Now, city is also, there's another discourse within the discursive domain of the city. City as a space of contestation between the religious and the rational. So, if you look at, to me, when I was reading this, it struck me because, if you look at the debate, we belong to a group of reality that is less religious and more rational. We imagine the city as a rational space, and this rational space is imagined in the domain of the public. And if you look at this debate regarding the city and the public, there's a beautiful writing by, a long time ago, I remember reading Immanuel Kant and Hegel, of Hegel and Immanuel Kant imagining the city, defining the city, and in the city, the public space as an impersonal, rational space. Very interesting. I've forgotten the nitty-gritty of that debate. But this idea of the religious versus the rational is something that many, many cities across the world are experiencing. Some people call it the sacred and the profane. So there is a debate about this notion of certain religion wanting to dominate its master narrative over a city, and against that master narrative arises, in the historical evolution of city, the notion of rationality. If you look at Europe, the rise of the Enlightenment was the destruction of the world or the cities that was controlled by religion. Christianity had a control over all cities, and with the Enlightenment, they lost control of the city. And with the Enlightenment arose modernity, and with modernity arose science, and with science arose, disciplines of all particular kinds. So this is a second narrative in which the discourse is taking place: the religious versus the rational. And I see Buddhism as part of the rational. I see Buddhism as part, the Ambedkarites as part of this rational discourse, the rational force against the force of religion. The third discourse is city are a sites of collective provision, collective consumption, and the working of civil society. They are shared spaces, a space of parallel and sometimes intertwined lives, joint projects, externalities and neighborhood effects. And in that particular sense, a city is a space of private or public provision and private or public consumption. Now, you have a totally different debate taking place, especially in the domain of discourse. Many of us were talking about the state's responsibility for entitlements, whether it's water, whether it's electricity, whether it's a PDS system, whether it's a health system, whether it's education. This notion of the idea of who is providing and basically who is consuming, and what are the private provisions and the public provision. For instance, road is a public provision. For instance, health is a public provision. What is it that is private? The debate between the state and the market. The market says, this belongs to me and you have to pay for it. The state says, no, it doesn't. It belongs to the larger public. It's a public good. You can use it. So there is a huge, massive debate about this when it comes to the city at this point in time. So these are some elements of the discourse. The third one, which I've kind of just thrown out to you, is the debate about especially the Marxist perspective. And these people are very strong because they are the cutting edge theory about city at this point in time. And these people rooted around the notion of the economic conditions of people, and the economic is a material base for the production of everything in the city, whether it's culture, whether it's entertainment, whether it's mass media, whether it's state, whether it's religion, whether it's name it. They believe that fundamentally, if you were to draw the very source of all of these so-called superstructure production, you will find the economic structure, and the city can be imagined only from the gaze of the economic. Now, many people have contested this, and we know that people are talking not only about economics, they're talking about culture and economics as one. And India is a beautiful place for that. So it's not only the economic base in which Babasaheb kind of contested the socialists and the Marxists in the 1940s and the 1950s. And there's a reason for that, you know, and the production of a new form of culture and so on and so forth. So, in the light of the Marxist debate, there's two kind of debate. One is a class and a political economic perspective of class and political economic issues. Another one is called culture and identity issues. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what perspective you hold, the Ambedkarites and Buddhists are located strongly around culture and identity without forgetting the importance of the so-called class and the political economic condition. So I think Shailesh will share some beautiful examples of how people basically came to Mumbai and how they came and they intersected with spaces in Mumbai, and how after 60 years they have moved to Navi Mumbai, and what kind of realities we have there and what kind of new culture they are producing in Navi Mumbai and so on and so on. So this is a big debate, and I think it's a very interesting debate. Uh, the fourth thing which I think I want to throw here is the notion of differences, diversity and differences in the city. Now, this is a big debate about cities. I was just reading some of these articles and I realized some amazing kind of debates taking place here. Differences are not simply registered as the social, cultural, or economic level. They are also constituted symbolically with groups inscribing spaces and zones with particular meanings and discursive practices, which may or not be visible to others. So this the idea of age, the idea of culture, the idea of religion, the idea of ethnicity, the idea of linguistics, these differences, which some Marxists kind of let go for a while because they think that all of these are superstructure reality. Actually, these now have become a fundamental basis by which people study to understand the city. You cannot let go of this notion of diversity and differences in the production of what you call a city culture or city life. Now you will hear many people talking on this particular line. Now, by differences, I mean many, many differences. It can be age differences, it can be gender differences, it can be linguistic differences, it can be religious differences, and so on and so forth. So this is a major area in which people are looking at it now. And what is interesting is that people, in realizing and studying these particular differences manifested in the realms of culture, many people are bringing their so-called historical, culture, historical religion, historical linguistic, inscribing into the city and producing the city around differences. Now, what is unfortunate here is that there's a beautiful point that is noted. Let me read this particular point which I found. Differences are constituted across many dimensions and each multiply and intersect with one another in complex, fluid, and diverse ways. Differences are constructed in and themselves construct city life and space. Differences are constructs. Our culture is a construct. Our religion is a construct. But these constructs actually have reproduced constructs in the city and imprinted in the city itself, especially in terms of both life and the space. They are also constituted spatially, socially, and economically, sometimes leading to polarization, inequality, zones of exclusion and fragmentation, and at other times constituting cities sites of power, resistance, and the celebration of identity itself. So many people are entering these domains of the study of the city from this particular kind of a perspective to understand. And I think for us it's very meaningful to look at it from that particular lens. Now, the last point which I want to make here before I stop is that many people are studying the city also from the notion of what you call the open, civilizing, and democratic possibilities of a city. What is it that the city offers to us in terms of an open space, devoid of structures that are rigidly defining you and entrenching you to a historical reality that disallows you to move, as in a closed system. A city is an open system, okay? And this openness of the city, if you look at it from a systemic perspective, it's beautiful. This openness of a city, there are different definitions of what it means to be an open system. An open system allows energy in and it allows energy to flow out. A closed system doesn't allow energy in, doesn't allow energy to go out. The city in this country is one of the only spaces in which energy, whether you like it or not, is always open to enter and open to leave. That is what we use the word dynamic to represent a city. Second, a city is the only place in which not civilization, but civility can arise. Civilizing can arise. And the search for the notion of the civil Not in terms of a civil society, that's another debate altogether, but the notion of civilizing. Look at what has happened to the Ambedkarite Buddhist community in 60 years. What has happened to our culture from where we came from and where we are now? And what has taken place to our families, to the way we talk, to the way we dress, to the schools that we send, to the thinking that we have in our minds, and so on and so forth. Look at what has taken place simply because of the possibilities that city offers. The third, democratic possibilities. It is only the cities that if you look at the history of the Uttar Pradesh, till the time when these so-called, votings was taken place by this, where people basically go and vote by this system that we have now, villages were not allowed to vote. They were not even allowed to vote because you have to go and vote through that paper ballot. So you are not allowed. The Indian village allowed democracy to actually exist, to penetrate itself into realities. But in the city, I cannot imagine. Otherwise, there will be a tremendous tension. Because in the city, you do not know who's voting for who's staying in what particular place. I mean, it's not that we don't know, we know. But it's not possible for someone to say, that particular basti will not be allowed to vote, otherwise we will there will be violence committed if you vote. So the possibility of democracy and democratic spaces arising from the notion of the city has fascinated urbanists, urban scholars, city scholars, city academics, and so on and so forth. Now, in this, there is a debate that is taking place around 2-3 points, which I want to mention. The relationship between the notions of the public realm and the city space. Probably we can throw some light later. The conception of the public and the private in the notion of the city. Okay, the public spaces and the private spaces. Okay? Your home is a private space, but outside your home is a public space. But it's so funny in India. You come to the city also. There are some people, they think that the whole city belongs. They're entitled to the whole city. Other people are not entitled, so they will behave as though the whole place belongs to them. And so this is nothing but a remnants of feudal caste mindset. But as a matter of fact, it looks odd if you do that. People will laugh at you. They say, well, "What are you doing?" So, and the notion of relationship between the extraordinary and the everyday life, and extraordinary in the sense of the possibility that the city allows you to not be ordinary but to be extraordinary. In relation to the notion of the everyday life that everybody has to live. So, how do you negotiate the Ambedkarite ideas in the city? How do you negotiate the Buddhist conception of the Buddhist reality in a city? How do you negotiate the notion of the public, of the Buddhist public in a city? How do we negotiate our ideas in the city? Is, I thought, something that we need to kind of discuss and throw some light about. These are the ideas in which we are talking about. And as I said, investigate a city as a and the beauty of a city is you can't objectify a city as part of the investigation process. You can't interrogate a city because a city is not an object. A city is a subject. So how does a scholar engage with the subject of a city? And a city has subjectivity. A city has emotions. A city has sensations. How do we, as Ambedkarites, engage with a subjectivity called a city? With a subject called a city, not with an object. It's moving all the time. You can't say that, I'm going to inquire about the city as though it's static, it's standstill, it's static. So that's not how exactly it works. We have to think seriously about how to make claims on a city. What is the role of knowledge in making claims about a city? We have to think about culture in the city. What kind of culture do we produce in the city as Ambedkarites and Buddhists? We have to talk about the notion of civility in the city, rationality in the city. So the city is an open space for us. The Ambedkarites have not entered the domain of the investigation and the interrogation of a city. This is a gold mine. And each of us, with all seriousness, now must think and produce a new discourse about the city in India and probably add up to the so-called complex discourses across the world. So with these few words, I will end my talk a little bit today.